Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating theological paper that argues the concept of a suffering Messiah wasn't just some retroactive invention to cover up a mistake, but was actually a deliberate cosmic heist. We're going to explore a profoundly different lens on one of the most debated topics in ancient literature. It's built around a framework called the Divine Council worldview, and it completely reframes the narrative of the Messiah. We're talking about shifting from a story of passive victimhood into a brilliant, highly strategic act of divine warfare. So if you think you know the traditional story of the cross, well, get ready to see it from a much more cosmic and, frankly, a far more strategic perspective.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Skeptics often point out a really specific detail. There is no single verse in the Hebrew Bible that explicitly predicts a dying Messiah. So, did early Christians just make it up to cover a failed mission? It's a persistent objection, and honestly, it is a completely fair question on the surface. Ancient and modern critics rightly observe that the specific Hebrew word Mashiach, the Anointed One, is literally never directly paired with suffering or death. It just doesn't show up in those famous suffering passages. Because of that, it's super easy to assume the disciples were simply caught off guard by a massive tragedy and hurriedly scanned their scrolls to piece together a post-game defense. But the paper we're looking at today argues that this perspective completely misunderstands how prophetic disclosure actually functions. You say, according to the source material, the pieces of this puzzle were absolutely always there. They were just scattered. For example, you have the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 who is crushed for the iniquities of others. You have Psalm 22, which reads almost like a photographic description of an execution centuries before the Romans even invented the practice. Then there's Zechariah 12, speaking of a pierced divine figure, and Daniel 7, introducing a son of man who suffers alongside the saints. The core thesis here is that this wasn't accidental, and it definitely wasn't sloppy writing. It was a theological necessity. The profile wasn't missing. It was deliberately scattered into a mosaic of clues so the hostile powers wouldn't see the trap until they walked right into it. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth would God hide this mosaic in plain sight? Well, to understand that, we have to look at the cosmic geography of the divine council and the rebellious Elohim ruling the nations. The paper draws really heavily on Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 82, which describe a massive cosmic rebellion. The basic idea is that the nations of the earth were literally occupied territory. They were disinherited by God at Babel and placed under the authority of lesser divine beings, these Elohim, who eventually went rogue, demanding worship for themselves and corrupting humanity. The New Testament calls them principalities, powers, and the rulers of this present darkness. So when the Messiah enters the world, he isn't just acting as a private religious teacher, right? He is a divine warrior stepping deep behind enemy lines. The Apostle Paul actually hits the nail on the head regarding the logic of this hidden wisdom. He frames the cross as a divine trap where the Messiah was the bait and the powers were completely fooled into springing it on themselves. When Paul says this, he isn't just talking about human politicians like Pilate or the high priests. He's talking about the unseen hostile spiritual powers. The paper argues that if the Hebrew Bible had explicitly stated, hey, the Messiah will die on a cross to defeat the spiritual rulers, those rebellious Elohim would have done literally everything in their power to prevent the crucifixion. The profile had to be scattered, the bait had to be hidden. That way the powers of darkness would mistakenly think they were winning, when in reality they were pulling the trigger on their own destruction. So what were the actual stakes here? The human condition wasn't merely a matter of breaking a few rules. It was a structural captivity that required a full-blown rescue mission into occupied territory. It was a triple threat. First, humans lost access to Eden and became captive to mortality and the fear of death. Second, they were held in bondage by those hostile Elohim we just talked about. And third, they were tainted by the cosmic corruption of rebellious heavenly beings, often referred to in ancient literature as the Watchers, basically rogue angels who deeply corrupted the earth. To save humanity, the Messiah couldn't just offer some good advice from a safe distance. He had to enter the realm of death, physically take on the constraints of mortal flesh, and totally undo the captivity from the inside out.
And this brings us to a really fascinating part of the paper's argument. The Messiah's pre-cross suffering wasn't just passive pain. It was a deliberate geographic provocation of the powers. Every single step was a calculated military strike. The wilderness? That wasn't just an empty desert. It was the haunt of demons, where the Messiah resisted the ultimate temptation. The exorcisms in Galilee weren't just medical miracles. They were evictions, stripping the spiritual occupiers of their usurped territory. And Caesarea Philippi, right at the base of Mount Hermon,
In ancient cosmic geography, that was ground zero for the heavenly rebellion. By declaring his church there, he was marching straight up to the literal gates of hell with breathtaking audacity, putting the powers on notice. And finally, Gethsemane was the agonizing acceptance of the final battle. Think about the trial for a second. The high priest didn't condemn him just for claiming to be a human Messiah. Technically speaking, claiming to be a human Davidic king wasn't a blasphemous offense punishable by death in the first century anyway. The real charge, the one that actually made the high priest tear his robes, was Jesus merging Psalm 110 and Daniel 7, claiming to sit at the right hand of power and ride the clouds. Now, in ancient Jewish theology, only God rides the clouds. He was claiming two powers Christology. He was claiming to be the second Yahweh. The dark irony here is incredible. By maneuvering the human authorities to condemn him, the spiritual powers unknowingly sentenced the exact being whose death they absolutely could not survive.
And then we get to the climax. The cross is where the rulers of this age think they have totally won. They are surrounded by the demonic bulls of Bashan. But actually, they've just triggered their own undoing. When Jesus cries out Psalm 22 from the cross, the paper points out an amazing detail. He mentions being surrounded by the bulls of Bashan. Geographically and theologically, Bashan was the territory of the giant clans, the heart of the underworld gateway, and ground zero for dark spiritual forces. The kingdom of darkness swarmed him. They thought they struck the fatal blow. But the thesis here is that the cross is the ultimate cosmic judo move. By killing an innocent, fully divine human who willingly took on the curse of mortality, the powers completely overplayed their hand and shattered their legal claim over humanity forever.
So, what does this all mean? It means the cross isn't just a single transaction. It's a total systemic reboot of the cosmos. It accomplishes this massive convergence of redemptive effects all at once. It disarms the hostile Elohim, totally stripping their authority. It cleanses humanity so they can re-enter God's presence. It reverses the ancient corruption of the Watchers. It even allows the Messiah to proclaim absolute defeat to the rebellious spirits imprisoned in the underworld. Most importantly, it reverses the curse of Babel, initiating the reclamation of all those disinherited nations back into God's family. The cross is the doorway, sure, but it swings wide open to something so much greater.
Of course, the story doesn't end on Friday. The resurrection is the ultimate vindication. It's that triumphant moment when the disciples' eyes are finally opened. The scattered mosaic is perfectly assembled, and the hidden wisdom becomes proclaimed wisdom. Before the empty tomb, everything the Messiah went through looked like a tragic failure to his closest friends. They just didn't have the theological key to read the scattered prophetic pieces yet. But the paper points out that the risen Messiah personally unlocks the scriptures for them on the road to Emmaus. And suddenly, the whole shebang, the wilderness, the exorcisms, the trial, the agonizing death, makes perfect, brilliant sense. It was the only way to rescue captives from the inside. The trap worked, the bait was taken, and the resurrection proves, once and for all, that the forsakenness of the cross was not the final word. We end by considering how this framework reshapes basically everything. If the Messiah's suffering was a highly strategic victory rather than a defeat, how does that transform the way we view our own battles in this world? This isn't just some abstract theological exercise. According to this explainer of the source text, the Messiah acts as the ultimate trailblazer. He proves that suffering isn't necessarily a sign of defeat or abandonment. Sometimes it's actually the exact terrain where the most decisive victories are won. He absorbed the absolute worst the powers could dish out, and he exhausted it. So the question I want to leave you with is this. If the ultimate cosmic victory looked like total defeat on a Friday afternoon, how might that change the way you view the struggles and seemingly impossible obstacles in your own life?